Yo, yo, yo.
Hey, hey, hey.
What is up, everybody? We're back. It's Actuali Podcast, Meaning Making 101, our special series covering John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I'm Chris,
I'm DJ.
and today's episode is on reverse engineering enlightenment, which should be really cool. I'm pretty stoked for this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, after last episode was awesome.
Yeah. And it was only just a setup for this episode.
Yeah, so let me get us up here on Mr. Facebook.
Getting up on the Facebook, the Book of Faces.
The Book of Many Faces. All right, we're
Yes.
live. What's up, Facebook fam? We are back. Actually, a podcast in the house with Meaning Making 101, continuing John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And hopefully that graphical glitch I'm seeing on the screen is just on my computer.
Yeah, let's hope it's just on your computer.
Stay.
Stop it.
Stay there. Don't make your way into the streams, please.
Yeah.
It looks good on.
I can check.
Looks good elsewhere.
I can check on the YouTube real quick and make sure.
I think we're solid. I'm going to get us shared up here. Thank you guys for joining us today. If you enjoy this series or are curious about how we may cultivate wisdom in this time of cultural crisis and social breakdown, this is the place. And we invite you to like John Vervaeke, whose series we've been following. He's a professor out of Toronto, University of Toronto, in Grand Old Canada. And what he's put together here is quite a masterwork, and it's a great gift to our times. So we welcome you, and so I'm just going to share things up on the social real fast here.
Sharing on the socials.
Oh, yeah. Tell them about the shows we got coming up next
What is it?
Saturday.
Next Saturday, the 26th, at Bad Habits. It's a metal festival.
Yeah, Bad Habits in Martinsburg,
In
West
Martinsburg,
Virginia.
West Virginia. It is kicking off, be there around 1-ish. That's when we're showing up. We're playing at 2:45. I don't know much more about it. I assume there will be food
It's a big
because
festival.
it's a restaurant.
A lot of great bands playing. Yeah, good food, good drinks, good peoples.
I'm a little unprepared. I don't know exactly who's playing and what's going on. Unfortunately, I had to leave shortly after playing because then I have another show up at the Shannondale Lake Clubhouse for their whatever Saturday night band extravaganza that they do, and that'll be Imaginary Man. So I'll be one busy fellow on that day. And then the next week, the 2nd of September at the Blue Fox.
Musical weekend. Oh, yeah. With Novarium and Fairy's Death Waltz in Winchester, Virginia at the Blue Fox.
And hey, if you don't like music and you still want to go to a place where there's people, there's a lot of pool tables.
Yeah, come out, have a good time. They do have a great pool hall there, and the stage is really nice too.
Yeah.
It's like two separate rooms, and the stage room has its own separate bar. And
it's actually a pretty smart way to go to. So you don't, when you go into the place, you don't have to pay a cover if you're staying in the pool hall area because they have the stage area separated, which allows regular business to go on for people who aren't there necessarily for the music, to just want to shoot some pool. And their table rental rates are actually very easygoing, and you won't be put out a whole bunch of money.
That's right.
Yeah, but and they serve beer in those big 24-ounce tankards, so you can feel like a Viking with your overlarge cup of beverage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was fun. And then anything after that? I think sometime in October, but that we'll let you know as the summer goes on, which is almost over. Sad.
Yeah, I'm excited for the leaves to start changing, for it to start cooling off a little bit.
That's the first reminders that it's going to be cold.
Truth. It
Winter
is,
time.
You're a big burly guy. You can handle it.
I don't like the cold.
No?
Nope.
I love it, man. I like how everything gets really crisp and clean, like the air. Everything's like frozen and refrigerated.
It just hurts.
And
it hurts my skin. It hurts my joints.
It does dry you out.
It hurts my mucous membranes in my lungs and my nose. The only thing I like about it is starting a fire in my wood stove and not moving any more than 5-6 feet away from it. You know.
Fair, fair. Well, that's like the nicest part. I love that. Love how you get to, warm up with some coffee or hot cocoa by the fire, and
No, see,
at least the fireplace.
I warm up with coffee and a cigarette, so I have to be outside, and then I come back into the fire.
Yeah,
You know,
the screensaver fireplace is popular these days. Doesn't have the same effect.
that
but
freaks
it
me
sounds
out so
nice.
much. Yeah,
This is where we're at, man. It's total Black Mirror mode, isn't it?
boy. Yeah, there's
Strange New World. Talked about this last episode.
yeah, yeah. You know, I'd almost prefer that world to the one that might be coming. You know, at least everybody was happy in their position in life.
Oh, it depends on which episode.
Yeah, well,
Black Mirror's
no, I mean Brave New World.
Brave
not
New
Black
World. Oh,
Mirror.
no, yeah. I'm still.
Now where everything's nice and
go.
you're well fed and comfortable and happy, and it's still a terrible, frightening dystopia. But yeah, and you get to be beautiful until you hit 70, and that's where everything runs out, and you just naturally die. So beautiful and young until you're old, and then you die. You die a little quicker. You don't live to be 100, but who wants to be old and gross?
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about 1984 and Orwell today too.
Oh man.
Triggered by something I was listening to. I was talking about towards the end of that where he's like commanded to hold up, or they're holding up 4 fingers, and he's declaring now, finally, at the end of the whole story, after they like really like break him down at the end, that it's 5.
Yeah.
It's 5 fingers that.
What was his name? Winston.
Winston.
Yeah. Yeah, that book doesn't have a happy ending. He breaks down and he breaks down and is assimilated into the system and is happy for it.
Mm-hmm. And loves Big Brother.
Yeah.
Drinking oily gin with his compadres at the end.
Yeah, and everything's better for him if you know. But he didn't have. Well, that's how he felt though. He was like, I was out of my mind for believing all that nonsense. It's way better now. I don't know what's in this, but it's double plus good, eh?
But he felt the heights of joy and bliss and freedom for a short time.
Yeah.
Contrasted with the existence that he had been living.
Yep, and he even got to have sex with a cute girl too. Mm.
He did make love, yeah. He was genuinely falling in love with her, and I don't remember if, it's been a while since I read that book.
Yeah.
But I have a vision in my head now of when he gets to start renting like this place, and I think it's an apartment above this antique shop that he finds in the slums, and he has this place where he can read and write and do all the forbidden things.
And he doesn't have to hide in the corner on the TV side of the or on the TV wall,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because in 1984, it's this book by George Orwell that was describing like a dystopian future scenario, and in the story, everybody's TVs are constantly recording.
And
so they're not just,
and
you don't just watch them, they watch you.
And they're constantly on, and all you can do is turn
you
turn the brightness and the volume down, but not off.
But not all the way.
Yeah.
So never all the way.
It's always chattering at you.
The TV wakes you up.
And it's watching you.
Yeah. All the time.
All the time.
Yeah. Everybody's being watched all the time.
So they're built into the walls, right? So he has to, if he wants to write in his journal, he has to go into the corner of his room that's on the TV wall side, so the camera can't see him. Mm-hmm. Which is fishy enough in and of itself, because if somebody notices that he disappears into that corner, and then they find his journal, he's done for. And Winston has one of the I would say higher positions in the bureaucratic hierarchy, not the highest, but he's the one who edits old newspapers and old stuff like that to make it true.
Yes, to update the news.
So it's basically like the way I would describe it is like if you had England at the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, then modernizing a bit, but a socialist hellhole. It's INGSOC is the party, English Socialism, or English Socialist Party is the name of the governing force. And then there's global war that's happening, but is it actually happening? Because nobody really sees anything outside of their little designated area within their country, and there's
Yeah, I
supposedly
think Hunger Games. It's similar in a lot of
Mhm.
respects, but it's yeah. I mean, the destruction of history is a big part of
Yeah, yeah.
1984 for sure.
Newspeak, like the term newspeak comes from that. It's like instead of saying, oh, this steak is absolutely fabulous. It's so savory and rich, and the crust on,
Yeah,
and
and
being
juicy,
descriptive.
and yeah,
It's
double plus good.
yeah, it's plus or double plus good.
Yeah,
And so everything's broken down into a way so you can't even think complex thoughts.
mm-hmm.
Because, as we learned from Vervaeke, literacy allowed us to complexify and open up our ability to hold on to information. Now, if you remove all the words except for the most base
You limit
words,
critical
good,
thought.
good, there's not good, better, best. It's good plus good, double plus good.
Right.
So in the movie, one of his buddies is sitting there and he's like, I don't know, I don't know what's in this stew, or I don't know what's in this meat. And then everybody looks up because like there's this questioning thing, like you're not supposed to question things, but he says, oh, but it's double plus good, eh? And then everybody goes back to eating whatever the hell they're eating, and it's like,
Nervous
woo!
moment. Yeah,
Boy.
yeah. And language was oppressive. That's why they were breaking it down
Yes, yeah.
to like the barest
And then,
elements as they could.
what is it? War is peace.
Freedom is slavery.
Slavery. And,
Something is truth.
yeah. So I actually saw something that
Ignorance is truth.
Ignorance is
yeah.
truth. And
War
I
is
saw
peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance
I
is
saw
truth.
something that kind of like freaked me out. It was like an advertisement. I think it was on like a Skittles package or something like that. But it was, what was it like? Oh man, I don't want to ruin it. But basically, the point was like like joy or something or another was. I don't want to say revolution because that wasn't the word, but was something, and it just reminded me of Orwell. How war is peace. Well, we redefine words by putting them together, and if you would have flipped them around, you would have been like, oh no, that's a horrible thing to say. But because of the way it was, I wish I could remember exactly what it was, because it's just one of those little bits of whatever. You're in the gas station and you actually I might have a picture of it, but yeah, it's just strange stuff. And there's people who were trying to warn us, and they're not prophets, like they're reading the future. You're just able to pick up on, if you're really good, seemingly minute input that all put together, you can figure out where it's going. And if it continues on the trend, then, well.
Yeah, and if you understand a little bit of history and you have an interest in nuance and understanding that things are never quite as black or white as they seem, you're trying to understand things from multiple perspectives so that you can get a more holistic view on what's happening and a greater understanding. That can be helpful. That can be very helpful. We got to learn how to orient ourselves in this world where there's so many competing interests vying for our attention. And they're all quite tribal and polarizing these days, those voices that are the loudest in the extremes of any direction. Finding a way, what is that middle path through a time of chaos? I think Vervaeke has been showing us that. He's been revealing a way. The most comprehensive answer I've seen for answering, like attending to the actual root of the many myriad crises that are ongoing right now in our world.
Well, it's an attempt to actually do something about something instead of making prescriptions based on how we think the world is.
Mm-hmm.
And the world is like this, so we got to do this. We got to do this. We just got to just stop oil.
You're right, because in this whole series, he keeps on helping us reveal to ourselves our capacity for self-deception, and in doing so, he's helping us learn to constantly reframe things, be malleable and open in our thinking, while still being critical and looking for ways that we can verify if something is actually true and real for us, so that we can then act upon it. And then understanding even how to embody ourselves so that when we act, we're acting with the greatest amount of wisdom and carefulness.
Yeah, it's interesting how often I hear the people say, "Oh, I don't believe anything," or like, or
Yeah,
why
a
do
lot
you
of
believe
people
in
are.
that? How do you believe in
Yeah.
that? I don't believe in anything because whatever. And it's just like, well, don't that ain't that just stupid? I hate to be that guy, but it's like I don't believe in anything. It's like, well, obviously that's not true because you have to believe in certain things. But on the other end of that, if you don't believe in anything, you're gonna fall for anything, right? There's the saying about that that some wise guy came up
I
with.
think the don't believe in anything might be a kind of giving up.
Yeah.
It's people are just exhausted and they're
Well,
becoming increasingly disenchanted.
yeah, and frankly, I hear it mostly from people who never really got involved with anything and understanding what's going on in the world to begin with, and now that it's all crumbling down around them, there's a high pressure, and it's
There are sometimes the ones jumping on the bandwagons the
yeah,
loudest.
and then the other thing that gets me
For
is
safety, for fear of
the
being ostracized.
the I don't care, but then they'll flip out when they hear a news story that's crafted
For them to be offended by, and for their personal.
and then they do care. It's like, okay, well, obviously you do care. So what do you care about? And it's like, well, all we need is unity. And I'm like, okay, well, what the hell does unity mean? Because there's a lot of people that have used that word. Mao used the word unity. Unity, what was it? Unity, conflict, unity. And look what happened with that. So it's like, yeah, I get it, unifying as a human race and everything. But what do you mean by that? What does that entail? Let's go deeper into
What is
that.
your version of unity?
We have to understand where we are in history as well as where we are right now. And then, and then there will be the argument of like, well, that's getting political and I don't want to be political. And it's like, well, unfortunately right now, everything has been skewed into being political. And now and this isn't just the United States, but
Everything has been politicized, and we are in the United States, where it is kind of our responsibility as you know, people that have inherited a system of self-governance to really kind of stay on top of what's happening in our public affairs.
yeah, not just,
And it's a something of a burden, but it's also a high responsibility, and it's a great gift. I mean, what a privilege to live in a nation where we value freedom, liberty, and justice.
and
Now we haven't been doing it perfect, and we've made a hell of a lot of mistakes along the way, some atrocious mistakes. But we're humans, and humans have been making mistakes in their individual nations for eons, and all as despicable as our own here in this
we
new
have countless
country.
myths and stories about about it. We even write stories about fictional universes that never happened to tell.
Right, but this is the first time that we've done this on our own without an aristocratic. Well, now we have an aristocratic rule and elite, I would argue, but the point was to not be run by tyrants, to not be serfs under nobles and kings, but for everybody to have equal access to the market and to entrepreneurialism and to self-achievement and all of that.
And well, back when
And it's not perfect. I mean, we still got a lot of work to do in realizing this American dream, but it spawned so many other great democracies and, republic democracies and congressional-based countries around the world for a reason, because it's pointed in the right direction. And we are still figuring out how to calibrate this thing, or we can work on it together instead of othering one another. And what we were talking about just a couple minutes ago now, it's everyone's jumping into teams and tribes, and we talk about unity sometimes, but are you talking about unity in a way that is disparaging and cutting out others and seeing others with the worst kind of blanket overgeneralizing stereotypes, like everyone that votes for this guy is that, and so on and so forth? I mean, we become so identified with our tribes, and we forget how to be individual humans. And the root of individual is to recognize that you are indivisible and interconnected with everything and everyone around you, but you have your own unique expression, which is something that I think would appeal to a lot of the radicals right now. It's like your unique expression doesn't need to be snuffed out, but we are all in this together, and we got to stop demonizing and dehumanizing one another.
And one thing too is like what we really ought to get back to is when we see our side going wrong, calling it out.
Yeah, man.
And
really
DJ, when have you ever done that? I don't know, man. Like I used to be on the left, super liberal and everything, and I'm seeing it going wrong, and I call it out, and I there's hell to pay for.
People got mad at me for calling out Obama.
Yeah, it's just like,
and like, why don't you ever call out Trump? And I'm like, I have called out Trump, but
you're not going to remember it because it probably didn't hit your feed because it won't piss you off.
But I also am not seeing as many people call out our own side when it goes wrong and astray. But I see it's very, very popular to talk about Trump as, you know, on into insanity. So it's you know, the TDS is real, sad to say.
Yeah,
But
and for people who don't know, that's
Trump
specifically derangement syndrome. You can have like a canine derangement syndrome that gives you a severe phobia and hatred of dogs. That happens. Same thing with, you know, you could have cultural derangement syndromes that lead to mass levels of genocide, as what happened to.
Well, they made a mutant monster out of a guy that already had enough, you know, inept social graces that you could capitalize on in real life. But he's not this mutant monster that he's been made out to be. It's hilarious.
I mean,
You know, the guy does not actually seem to be racist at all, though
he's
clever clipping of videos seem to show him to be as such. And I'm not a fan of this kind of dishonest tactic. I don't want us to win by any means, fair or foul. I want us to win fairly, and I don't even want my side to win. I want humans, because, you know, I don't have a side. My side is Earthlings. It's life on this planet. You know, I don't see the point in becoming so ideologically possessed that we think only our tribe, only our side is right. I think that's obscene.
at the very least, we can recognize, say, like with a Trump figure or somebody else, no matter how bad you think they are, chances are they're no worse than the swamp rats that you're following.
Yeah.
Or that you would much rather have that maybe isn't on your side, but would be what you think of the lesser of two evils. Like when you get down to it, the ruling elite in this country and in the world are pretty sick and dark people. That used to be a left liberal thing to say. Mm-hmm. Now I'm a right wing conspiracy theorist, and I'm like, guys, dude, I'm a slow moving thing. I'm a rock that gathers lots of moss, man. And
yeah, no, like you all used to talk about this. We used to be the pro peace, not a fan of war side of the spectrum.
Still don't like
those
the
of
war.
us that identify with liberalism, and I don't even think there's anything wrong with liberals when people on the right are upset with what's happening on the left. They should be, you know, it's helpful to point out we're talking about leftists, not liberals. True liberalism is what helped found this country. Like
you can be a left liberal, like, so left is statism, and right is basically individual anti-statism, and then you have authoritarian and libertarian. You can be libertarian left. You can't go super far libertarian left because that automatically goes to authoritarian because it's statism, and statism has a curve that leads up into authoritarianism. Well, I was trying to come up with a better plot, and I realized the further left you go,
well, it all goes in a circle eventually, I guess. But
no, it does circle back around. But like the further
there's authoritarian left right now.
Yeah, well,
And
that's the thing.
You can equate that with the far left. We have an idea of the far right, but the far right's been over exaggerated
well, no,
because not everyone that voted for Trump was far right.
Well,
I
you
think
could
a small
even
minority of
you
people.
know, like Green Party people or Social Democrats or Democratic Socialists, or most of the Democrats we have are on the authoritarian top side of the left.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. Now there's a few that are more individualists, but that skews closer to center. And on the right, you can get top right authoritarian rightism, but that's like a king, a feudal lord, or a top exec CDO, and that's horrible. The bottom far right bottom corner is true, like pure anarchism, ultimate individualism, which doesn't really work.
Right.
So, you know,
We need some kind of
the chart
social
skews
structure.
up always. The further right or left you go, it always skews up into
Yeah,
authoritarianism.
until we're perfect little angels, we're not going to achieve anarchism. But it's a beautiful ideal for us to strive towards, to
it's
be
good for the
mature enough beings to be able to manage ourselves so that we don't need a government in the way that we traditionally see them.
Well, you know, like some
Decentralized, autonomous node networks is a great idea for future civilization. But how do we become mature enough to pull it off? I think that's the great question of our time.
We got going for us is, for the most part, like handicap parking spots. Most people don't park in them, not because they're going to get the $10,000 fine or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah.
They don't, or $100 fine or wherever you're at. Most people don't park in it because they're like, yeah, you know, handicapped people, it's easier for them to get the
Someone
front door
might
from
need
here.
it. Yeah.
Now, mind you, there are people who still say like screw it, but like most people,
But not many.
don't need the law to tell them to just go ahead
be
and not
decent.
be. They just need a reminder, like, hey, this is the spot that we allowed this to happen. Yeah. Oh, okay. Like drop offs in the back. You don't have to have a law that says it. Oh yeah,
Yeah. Well, let's get into these notes before we get carried on any longer here. So we've got a short recap that we'll do here
This was
of our last episode.
Religio, Perennial Problems, and Reverse
Reverse
Engineering Enlightenment.
Part 1, yeah.
And the first proposal was moving off of sacred, like a sacred object, to sacredness. What is this ness?
Separating the supernatural idea of sacred from actual sacredness, which does seem to occur cross-culturally. And so we're trying to move beyond the two worlds mythology into a form of spiritual realization that can be in contact and communication with science, that science can measure and understand, and so that we can help heal science, because it's, it becomes quite an ideology itself. There's a lot of certainty that creeps into scientism that can occur, and spirituality on its own in a two worlds mythological framework seems to be separative as well. So bringing science and spirituality back into partnership and communion as they were previously in history in parts of this world, such as in ancient Greece, seems to be a very healthy marriage for our societies. So the proposal, the Tao, is not necessarily supernatural or absolute. It is actually something that is immeasurable, inexhaustible. I know I'm jumping forward, but we're going to not go too deep on the notes because we've spent about 25 minutes already warming up.
Let me just go through this real quick, because I got some points that need to be made up.
Go ahead, man.
The source of sacredness is not necessarily sacred to us. Relevance realization is not about detecting what is inherently relevant. Relevance does not have an essence; it is evolving. Sacredness we are looking at sacredness as the inexhaustibleness of this reality. So when it comes to the object is not the source of the sacred, because the object, objects are combinatorially explosive. Nothingness is beyond, no thingness is beyond the frame.
Yes. So a symbol like a cross
the process is ever ongoing.
Ever ongoing, yeah. So the symbol of the cross can itself be inherently sacred. It's pointing to something that is inherently, inexhaustibly unfolding. So it's pointing to the infinite. What it points to is sacred, and this is shared this analogy last time.
Itself is not the sacred.
Yeah, the finger. You can get confused with the finger pointing at the moon. The finger's pointing at the moon. That's what it's pointing you to look at. So we can be worshipful of something, perhaps, and reverential towards something, but it is the inexhaustible fount that is the true sacred, and we constantly get confused. This is why our cultures get into wars. And this is how we might help ameliorate that, by bringing about this understanding, this common understanding that, sacredness, what all of our symbols and God figures are pointing to, is that inexhaustible, immeasurable source from which we all came, that maintains existence yet remains an unfathomable, unknowable mystery. So that I love that he points this out. This is a really deep concept, but it's very well articulated in this episode 36, the previous guy. So check it out if you like, if you'd like to dig deeper into this.
Yeah, and this method that he's going through is freeing us from the two-world mythology, and I'll call it a fallacy, because, if there was two worlds, you'd still exist in it, and it would be one world, frankly. So he has some steps that he goes through, and that he wants to go through to do this. The first one is understanding the machinery of fittedness as integratable with science, which we've talked a lot about in this series so far. And then the next step is show how the model of relevance realization addresses history. So going through history, how we realize things, but also how we can use a theory of, not the theory of relevance realization. The theory of relevance realization to analyze the past.
That's right, yeah.
So we're in this meaning crisis, which has historical factors and structural factors,
which present as perennial problems. Repeating problems throughout history. Perennial, they keep coming back.
And to deal with the perennial problems, we developed wisdom cultivation practices, right? Like, whether it's sitting around the fire and doing the stalking of the deer thing, or going to a monastery and learning high level.
The Buddhist coming up with the middle way.
So what do we need to do to fix well, first off, historical factors as well as perennial problems can undermine our wisdom cultivation practices.
Yes.
We could just get rid of them outright, or we can pervert them in some way or another. So we can, to fix the meaning crisis, we can use the relevance realization machinery to give a response to the historical factors. And he referenced what was it, third generation or 4E cog sci.
Cognitive science.
Yes. And then relevance realization and religio to address the perennial problems and reverse engineer engineer our enlightenment practices, or make new ones out of, it's like coming across the alien spaceship and making one for yourself.
Right. So finding a way to re-articulate our worldview, our sense of sacredness through religio to afford self-transcendence, meaning, and involvement with this world. Because we are indeed in a mode of dukkha, modal confusion. Our capacities for cultivating wisdom and enlightenment or salvation are running headlong into the fact that we are so prone to self-deception and self-destructive behavior. So the very thing that gives us the strength and the potential for growth through innovation also causes us to be prone to self-deception. Recognizing this within ourselves, constantly being willing to reframe and reorient ourselves together through a mode of being here in the world rather than a mode of having needs. We're coming from our place of being, appreciating one another. It's the agape love orientation that Christ demonstrated for the world.
All right. So, of relevance realization and religio, there's three aspects to it. There's the functional, structural, and the developmental. We didn't really talk about the developmental in last episode. So on the functional level, we have RR, which is our self-organizing and self-IDing aspect. Then we have self-reflection, and then we have and self-reflection. Now these can go wrong. So on the self-organizing end, you can get into parasitic processing, which is a complex of behaviors and heuristics that lead you down a negative spiral instead of a growing spiral. And then you have this self-reflection, and it goes wrong by making you being incapable to act because you're over reflecting, and we get into the reflectiveness gap. This is where it goes wrong, when you're stepping back too far, because you need this gap in order to get agency, but if you go too far into this gap, you lose agency, so you get a bell curve effect. And we have to we have to shift our thinking from, say, being the example was shifting your thinking from being you're thirsty, you're wanting of liquid. You shift it to now you are aware of your thirst. So now it introduces curiosity. But if you don't shift, then you go too far into the reflectiveness gap and too deep into it, and then you become incapable of acting and you lose your agency. And it's a colloquial term is analysis paralysis, when you're trying to remodel or make a decision on what you want to do. You just get so much and so much and so much, and then you can't make any decision, just like poor Hamlet. And then everybody died.
And then the other aspect of functional relevance realization is self-identity, which can go awry as modal confusion. So we're switching into our having mode instead of our being mode.
Yeah, and that one we talked about, particularly in the episode about Prince Siddhartha, so the Buddha, and him having to leave when he first left the palace and seeing people who are sick, old, and dead. And then realizing that what he has in his palace isn't what actually is.
And we're doing all of this again because Vervaeke wants to reverse engineer enlightenment to understand what were the perennial problems that the ancients who developed these different self-realization and enlightenment techniques, what were they trying to ameliorate? What were they trying to heal? What were they trying to fix? And what is the set of practices that we can today continue to utilize to ameliorate these perennial problems and accelerate this healing process? Because we got to counteract this downward spiral that seems itself to be growing at an exponential rate.
So he gets into the structural end, and briefly, so in the structural end of RR and Religio's meta meaning and agent arena relationship, within meta meaning, where that goes wrong, you could be led into absurdity, anxiety, or alienation. And absurdity, well, let's start with the self first. Alienation is you being separated from your peer group, other people. Anxiety is you and yourself.
Well, okay, so absurdity is you and the
Agency,
world becoming
me.
disconnected.
Yeah.
You in a stable relationship with the world just reality falls out from underneath you and things are absurd. Anxiety is you and yourself.
Yes, that's what it was.
So a disconnect between you and your
then alienation is you and others, and this all leads to domicide.
Yes. Yes. And what is domicide?
Domicide is the death of the home, whether it's your actual home or your feeling of being home.
Yes,
your
the loss of the sense of home. Yes. Yes.
And then the agent arena, where that goes bad, is you got existential inertia, which you just keep going and keep going and keep going, and then on the other end of that, you have the existential ignorance. I don't know, like you'll never know what it's like to have a kid unless you have one. But should I do it? And then
yeah, right.
And those together give you existential entrapment. So in agent arena, it's existential entrapment is where that goes bad.
Yes, and that is what has given us the meaning crisis.
Yeah, and so he goes into absurdity more here. It's a perspectival and participatory thing, and he brought up Nagel and Nagel's argument, and I'm not going to go too far into that argument. More, I'm just going to bring up the story that he brought up. Well, real quick, the argument basically is when we're making certain arguments, like, you know, if I could live forever, things would be better. It's like, well, that just leads to absurdity, because how does length of time, if anything, the length of time would lead you to have a horrific life,
for life to become more absurd.
And you know, and so the argument or after the fact of the absurdity of the argument, like so. I'm not explaining it too well, but
people that say life is meaningless just because I'm so small.
Yeah, well, where does it
compared
get you?
to like the span of time and how big this universe is. So, well, if you lived forever, how absurd would life be then? And you're actually giant to atoms, but you're small,
we're
exactly to the galaxy or the universe.
We're exactly in the middle of size.
But that's what is probably
stuck here in
more
the
accurate.
middle with you. So we need to drop out of the proposal knowing.
Propositional knowing. Yeah, because we're always making proposals, and this is having mode. I'm making propositions and stating beliefs to identify myself, rather than being in the being mode.
Yeah,
where the self is more amorphous. It can grow and it can change, and you're abiding in this moment, and you are in concert and relation with this moment as it is. More and more so as you are increasingly capable of reframing reality, and you are able to reflect on reality. So you're not just being pulled around by things and thinking of everything as separate and other and blaming the world outside for all your problems. You're actually feeling yourself in a relation with everything. And it's a different kind of dance.
So Nagel has an example in Everyday Absurdity, and this is paraphrasing, but basically Tom is this guy that loves this woman. He's freaking out all day, like being like, I need to call you to tell you everything, like all my love, and express this. So he finally
just realized how much I appreciate you, and he thinks about these nice things that he says, and he just kind of expresses his love.
So what ends up happening, he's away all day, and then finally he picks up the phone and calls her and hears her voice, and then just starts unloading. And before you go, like all this stuff, and then please leave a message after the beep.
Right.
And that's kind of humorous. It's absurd, but humorous, because we can come to a resolution at the end of it. But absurdity is when it's not humorous, it's horrific. There is no resolution to it. Like the example I made last week is, well, he's having the same thing that he needs to tell his mom, and he goes to leave a message, but then he gets a call immediately after he gives off the phone that his mom's dead. That's not humorous. It does not resolve itself. It just leads into horror and awfulness. So absurdity can be funny, much like Monty Python and crew, or it can be lead into horror.
On the borderline of horrific or lead into, yeah.
Yeah, and the last thing I have, so all this that we were talking about in this episode, in these notes, even though it's the thing that can free us from entrapments and help us understand the universe, is the very same machinery that can lead us into more suffering, the dukkha suffering, the unbalancing and shaking apart.
We have to be able to recognize
Suffering.
when that's happening. And another thing I picked up from this episode is he kept on pointing out that, how absurdity and horror is telling us some things cannot be easily made sense of. Though, or so, we, as such, experience a loss of connectedness, horror, domicide, absurdity. This causes us to experience a sense of disconnection. And that's why absurdity can become horrific. Life can become horrific.
Yep.
So that's it. Yeah, all of our relevance realization machinery has a dark side, and it presents us these perennial problems. Very machinery that makes us adaptable also makes us self-deceptive. So now we're going to continue reverse engineering enlightenment so that we can understand how to optimize practices as we continue to grow forth as humans, awakening from this meaning crisis. So, Mr. John Vervaeke is in the house.
Hey, and that intro wasn't too long, considering we went for like 15 minutes jibber
Oh,
jabbing
we
about
went like
life.
25 minutes talking, and then we did a good.
We're
now it's about 40
trying to
minutes.
keep
in,
it
so
concise.
Thank you, guys.
So, but yeah, it's actually nice. Our viewer retention rate is actually not that bad, like percentage wise of the video, and we do long ones. So thank you for those who stick around for large portions of this. I do realize it can be a
and
lot.
you're welcome to listen after the fact. If you can't listen to it during the live stream, these are always going to be backed up on YouTube and on all of the various social media networks. We're also on Facebook and Twitch. So, and actually we're on Twitter, but I haven't started putting videos up there yet. We should be working on that too. But there's links on Twitter. If you go to our Twitter, that'll pull you towards where you can watch some stuff. And yeah, I mean, you can listen to this rolling down the road on Spotify, guys. So make sure you like and subscribe. Give us a good rating on Spotify if you're enjoying the show. Smash the like and subscribe here on Actuali Podcast. And also, let's throw some love and some likes and subscribes over to Professor John Vervaeke. Look up John Vervaeke on YouTube or check the links in the summary for this video. We appreciate you guys supporting this movement.
He's starting to do shorts now too, so you might find some of them popping up.
Yeah, man.
So.
All right, guys, so this is it. This is episode 37 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Reverse Engineering Enlightenment, Part 2. We drop it in.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time we were taking a look at a proposal that we could understand the sacred, that which causes the experience of sacredness, in terms of a transjective inexhaustibility, a kind of deep anagoge between the no-thingness of your ever-evolving relevance realization and its mysterious depths, and the no-thingness of a reality that is ultimately combinatorially explosive and dynamically changing itself. And that we can acknowledge the important role of the symbolic, the way it helps us to engage and activate the primordial aspects of religio and go through processes of re-exaptation, causing new emergent abilities, so that as we're opening up the world, we are also opening up ourselves in response to that. But I cautioned against confusing indispensability, your own or our collective at times, indispensability with any kind of claims of metaphysical necessity or an absolute essence. And that was part of the larger critique that relevance can't have an absolute essence, and therefore we shouldn't think of the sacred ultimately as a supernaturally endowed, absolutely essential form of relevance. So I then proposed to you that part of what we saw, at least the experience of sacredness doing, was helping to facilitate the higher order relevance realization, the meta-realization between homing us against domicide, the meta-assimilation, but also causing us to confront the numinous, the meta-accommodation. And so the sacred is doing that. But I also proposed that we needed to look at this more deeply. We needed to look at how the sacred helps us address perennial problems. So that took us into opening up and becoming a little bit more analytic about the meaning crisis. There's two components to the meaning crisis. There are the historical factors, which we traced in detail at the beginning of the first half of the series. And now an issue that is now one we need to focus on, the perennial problems. Because in some sense, the experience of sacredness, the attempt to activate, accentuate, accelerate, articulate, and appreciate religio should address our perennial problems. The perennial problems are, of course, perennial because the very machinery of religio that makes us adaptive also makes us perpetually vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Most cultures cultivate an ecology of psychotechnologies, typically in the form of a religion, for addressing the perennial problems. But that set of psychotechnologies has to be fitted into a legitimizing and sustaining worldview. In some sense, the psychotechnologies have to be integrated with sacredness. What's of course happening for us is, and we'll come back to this in more detail here, the historical factors have undermined that possibility for us, undermined the experience of sacredness, all of the ways in which we can cultivate an ecology of psychotechnologies for enhancing religio, because we do not have a worldview within which that project of meaning-making and self-transcendence, the cultivation of wisdom, the affordance of higher states of consciousness, the realization of gnosis, we do not have a worldview that legitimates or encourages that. And so people are forced, as I said, to cobble together in a dangerously autodidactic fashion their own personal responses to perennial problems without traditions, guidance, communities, well worked out sets of, like I say, of practices, well vetted, well developed. And so that means they're often bereft when they face the perennial problems. So responding to the meaning crisis has two components to it. And that's why I call it awakening from the meaning crisis, because it has not only the response of trying to re-articulate a new worldview in which the project of enhancing religio, again, gets validation, is properly situated, encouraged, facilitated, legitimated, etc. But we also need to understand what the set of practices, the ecology of psychotechnology would look like that would allow us to address the perennial problems. And I'm proposing that the scientific account of relevance realization and religio, and I've already tried to give you some allusions to that, we're going to come back to it full force, will give us a way of articulating a worldview in which we can resituate the project of meaning making. And of course, the linchpin of that argument is the idea that at the core of the meaning making is relevance realization, and relevance realization can be given a naturalistic explanation. One that hopefully still does full justice to the experience of sacredness. But I want to concentrate, as we began last time, on the perennial problems. Because ultimately, that's the final thing. If I come up with a historical response, and it does not actually afford the addressing of the perennial problems helps people to ameliorate and perhaps alleviate the perennial problems, then this project has failed. So we need to start discussing the perennial problems and developing this thesis more extensively, that the very machinery that makes us adaptive makes us susceptible to self-deceptive, self-destructive patterns of behavior. So we talked about looking at some of the core features of religio, right? So we've got functional features. Right? And here we have, of course, self-organization. And I tried to develop that very explicitly. It's not just vague self-organization. It's opponent processing that's making use of self-organizing criticality, relationship between compression, particularization, and other such trade-off relationships, etc. We've got self-identification, that process by which you're creating an identity, and you've got self-reflection, your ability to step back and reflect on your own cognition, which of course was made so powerfully present in the axial revolution with the advent of second-order thinking. We took a look at the structural. This has to do with the components of the agent-arena relationship, the ways in which self is connected to the world, self is connected to self, and self is connected to others. Right? And then we looked at the developmental. And I sort of left that as a placeholder because I just wanted to give a quick overview last time, but I wanted to go in and draw this together, because what we've been talking about throughout the last few lectures is the idea that your cognition is inherently developmental. It functions by developing, it develops by functioning. Right? So because it's inherently self-organizing, it develops, right, by functioning. It functions by developing, and this is qualitative development, right? What I mean is you get a capacity for self-transcendence. There's not only an increase in what you know, but an increase in the kinds of things you can know, the kinds of things you can do, right? And this is ultimately some kind of process of optimization. So there's a developmental trajectory. And then what you can see, right, is some of the problems we've already talked about, the parasitic processing. In the notes for this lecture, I will put references to the previous lectures in which I have talked about these in detail. So if you, in order to avoid useless repetition, you can go back and look at the presentation, right? But this is, if you remember, there's a bad event and it spirals off and it gets this very complex self-organizing system that takes on a life of its own, becomes very compelling, very adaptively resistant to our attempts at intervention, etc. Okay, so this is modal confusion. This is the right from, but very much you can also see it being addressed by the Stoics. You can see it being addressed by Buddhism, as Batchelor argues. This is to get into confusion between the having and the being modes, the kind of I that you are. Are you in an I it, I thou, etc. Self-reflection, last time we talked about this. This is the reflectiveness gap. This comes from the fact that what we can do is we can step back and look at our own processing, and this gap affords us regaining our agency from the chaos of being the impulsive wanton. But when we open up the reflectiveness gap too much, we get also a loss of agency. We get the tragedy of Hamlet, And of course, some middling position is not the answer there, because at times you have to be highly reflective, at times you have to be highly immersed. How do we answer that? The problem here, right, with the self-world relationship is absurdity. As I said, this is the agent-arena relationship. And we talked about absurdity here and made clear that all of the arguments for absurdity, like what happens a million years from now, doesn't matter, I'm so small, I will die, none of these things actually are arguments that can legitimately lead to a conclusion of absurdity, because they're in many ways, and this was Nagel's point, they're just bad arguments, they're fallacious arguments. Now, dismissing the arguments is not to dismiss the person who makes the argument. I hope I made that clear last time. If not, I'm trying to do that now, because people are trying to articulate with these pseudo-arguments something real that is happening to them, something that is very important. So the arguments are after-the-fact expressions rather than the generators. And the main thing here, and this of course goes into, right, you can see how all of this is our perspectival, participatory ways of being, ways of knowing. Okay, but what's here is a clash of perspectives. Right? It's a clash of perspectives. When we did the example of Tom who's calling Susan, and how in humor that clash of perspectives can be resolved, usually by playing, like equivocating between terms or meanings, or getting people to make a connection they hadn't made before. But in absurdity, and I think there's an overlap like this, right, where you have humor as a resolvable clash of perspectives, and then you have absurdity here, right? And then there's an overlap zone, and like I said, there's a lot of humor. My prototypical example, tells my age when I was growing up, is the humor of Monty Python, in which, right, you get a lot of absurdity. But then you get what becomes irresolvable, clash. It's undermining religio in some way, undermining your agency in some way, and that's sort of pure absurdity. Okay. Self with self, this goes back to what we talked about with Tillich, right, and anxiety, inner conflict, and what we need here, right, is to, again, think about the ways in which this is connected to, right, self-deception, because the inner conflict, remember Plato, often skews your salience landscape and makes you susceptible to bullshitting. I'll talk about bullshitting in connection to this overall. Right? Of course, this is alienation. This is our inability to connect to other people, something that is often exacerbated through social media by the way these other perennial problems and self-deceptive behavior can be magnified in social media. So we can be modally confused and think by having a lot of connections we're overcoming our alienation and loneliness, but of course that's not the case. We can exacerbate the social media by falling into a sort of pretended narrative and things like that. Okay, here we talked about, right, existential inertia. This is when you need to move between worldviews, make a worldview viable that you're not currently in. We're going to talk a lot more about the work of Agnes Callard with aspiration. But the point here, and going back again to the seminal work of L.A. Paul, but this is basically a need for anagoge. How do I anagoge my way out of this worldview into another worldview? And then, of course, there's existential ignorance, a point made salient by L.A. Paul and also picked up by Agnes Callard in her book on aspiration, that, right, we can't sort of reason our way through this. We can't infer our way from a weaker logic to a stronger logic. We can't infer. We can't propositionally come up with the perspectival knowledge that we're lacking, with the participatory knowing that we do not currently possess, and the identity that we are not currently cultivating. So, right, all of that, of course, can come together, and this was mythologized, and I mean that in a complimentary sense, right? Remember how I'm using mythos? This is mythologized by the Gnostics of existential entrapment. feeling trapped. Now, a couple of things before we move towards starting to address this. This is analytic. This is for theoretical purposes that these things are being distinguished and laid out, right? It is often the case, as I've already tried to indicate, that these things are interacting and exacerbating each other, right? That, right, you can be experiencing absurdity and it can be really contributing to your existential inertia, right? You could be overthinking things and getting sort of stuck, and that, right, might be also contributing to your existential ignorance. Or it might be contributing to your modal confusion because you can't remember the being mode because you're caught up in having a lot of thoughts and trying to have a lot of beliefs. Right? I'm not going to try and map this out because the permutations of the ways in which these interact and afford and, right, exacerbate each other is very complex, which of course is why the perennial problems are so pressing on people. Now, what I want to try and do is to show you what I want to try and show you how we can salvage from the legacy so many psychotechnologies for addressing the meaning crisis.
We back.
In the saddle again. Sorry.
All right, guys. So let's recap what we just watched.
So it was pretty much just a recap of what we, like all of our notes from
Last episode.
We talked
he's
about
explicating a little bit further on things here and there, but it's definitely helped just remapping it. Here's the problem space that we're looking at.
Yeah, so we got the functional end where you have source, self-organization, self-IDing, and self-reflection. Where they go bad, the self-organization, so he expanded on what self-organization is. The self-organization is all these little trade-off relationships, the opponent processing, all that together is within the self-organization end. And the bad end if it goes bad, it's parasitic processing. Self-ID, if that goes bad, that's modal confusion. Self-reflection, when that goes bad, it's an unoptimized reflectiveness gap.
That's right. Yeah.
And the structural end, we have
that's the functional end of our relevance realization machinery, or cognitive
how
capacities,
it
functions. Yeah.
Yes, much like looking at like an engine or something and breaking down how it functions.
We're going to run through this fast, but before we jump ahead too much on that, let's just note we're doing this because how we articulate religio itself should help us attend to perennial problems. We have any psychotechnologies that we have to integrate to bring about the historical factor and integrate with sacredness, because previously the perennial problems have undermined this process of meaning making that we depend upon to be able to live a balanced state with one another. So we have the two components to responding to the meaning crisis that he outlines, that we need to re-articulate a new worldview, enhancing religio, and such that it's properly instantiated. And to do so, we're going to need to define what sets of practices work best for us and how can we integrate them. And then the proposal is we're going to bring he's sharing a theoretical framework for a scientific account of sacredness and religio, the experience of self-transcendence, to help us reinstantiate meaning-making in a way that does justice to sacredness still. So we're going to find a way to theoretically understand this so that we can better create the new systems. And that's kind of setting us up there. So let's jump back. So DJ just described the functional side, and there's three different sides here that we're looking at: functional, structural, and developmental. So the functional side, now we're jumping to the structural,
which is our agent arena realm. So so the agent to itself the agent to the arena, so the world, the agent to itself, and the agent to others. And so if you've got an issue with yourself in the world, that's a clash of perspectives that we call
That's the experience
absurdity.
of absurdity. Yes.
And if it's self to self, it's self-deception, the anxiety. And self to
inner
other
conflict,
is
yeah.
alienation, much like, what he explained with, the social media and stuff. You think, oh, well, I'm having so much more and I'm building my tribe and my people, but I feel more and more and more alone.
Yep.
It's very similar to the bell curve you get with the reflectiveness gap,
Yes.
If you don't have enough social contact, then you don't have a relationship with others. So your agent arena relationship is limited. But then there's an optimal point, and then there's a point where it's too much and you lose your ability to have a relationship with others.
That's right. Yeah, you can go too far out to be able to come back home and relate what you saw,
Yes.
basically. And we're doing all of this because each one of these facets of the downsides of our relevance realization, cognitive capacities, cause disconnection with ourselves and reality. And so we've looked at the functional. Now we've gone over the structural, the agent-arena relationship between self-world, self-self, and self-others. Now we're on to the developmental trajectory. And he lays that out by giving us the framework of we develop by functioning, by development, and by optimization. The downside of functioning is existential inertia. We have a need for anagoge, for the process of self-transcendence. And if we don't get it, we experience existential entrapment.
Yeah, and particularly when the problems of developing by function and functioning by development is the existential inertia. Well, you'll never know until you do, but should I do and then I don't, and then you're trapped. With the two of these things, you don't have an anagogic relationship, and you don't have the ability to understand by inference anymore.
That's
as
right.
far as, because how do you know what it's like to be dead, or how do you know what it's like to be a kid, or have a kid if you've never had a kid, or that kind of thing. And these two together, they entrap you existentially.
Yep.
And then there's optimization, which seems to be the word of the multi episodes. Optimize. It's not about maximize or minimize. It's about optimize.
Yeah, that's right. And that optimization means that you're constantly calibrating based off of what you're dealing with in said arena that you're operating in.
And so, the functional, structural, and developmental ends of religio and relevance realization, the good and the bad all cross-inform each other.
That's right.
And we can't really make a map. Well, I guess you could
can,
try
but
to.
It'd be very complex
and it
to lay out, and it would take a lot of time, and that's not...
And would it be worth it?
That's for the purpose. So he's laying out the theoretical framework so people can go and do that. But that's not what we're doing right now. We're just actually laying out the theoretical framework first and foremost.
Well, it's kind of like the little robot. There's too many options for what the robot's
in his
trying
next
to do right
series
now.
after this, which is already ongoing and pretty far way through, after Socrates, the process of developing wisdom has gone into in much more detail, and all of this is mapped out further. So I think that covers everything. All of these things interact and exacerbate one another. We've got that now. We see that there's ups and downsides to our relevance realization that cause us to have either increased sense of connection or a decreased sense of connection, of disconnection, in fact. So let's jump on in now and see where he's going to take us. I'm going to rewind about 20 seconds that we can comprehend where we at.
Boop, 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 boop.
The reason why
We did it right.
the legacy,
This is great.
I
I'm
want to
catching him with all his
show you
I love how hard he's
how
thinking.
we can
He's into it.
salvage from the legacy so many psychotechnologies for addressing the meaning crisis. The reason why I'm hesitating is because, again, this is genuine. There's a hubristic element here, and I'm not just trying to say, oh, taking it from you and leaving that behind. But again, I'm trying to get a balance between respecting where we really are and what our situation really is, and respecting all of the tremendous heritage and legacy that has been given to us. And trying to get that balance is always in my mind. It's very difficult. But, okay, I'm going to go through these, each one. First of all, I'm just going to sort of name so you can get an overall schematic, and then I'll erase the board, and I'll talk about each one in greater detail. Okay? So, be patient, please. I'm asking for your patience. I'm just going to give some indications about how we address each one of these schematically so you can see on the board, and then I'll step back and go through each one in more detail, and then how they're integrated together, and what's also missing from this in an important sense. So what I'm going to propose here is the way you deal with parasitic processing is, and this is why this is number one in some sense schematically, it's overarching. You've heard me talk about it before, with the idea of an ecology of practices, an ecology of psychotechnology, right? What you want to do is you want to cultivate a counteractive dynamical system. See, parasitic processing is a very complex dynamical system, and if you try and do one-shot interventions, it just reconfigures itself. What you need is to cultivate that you internalized. It can't just be something you think about. It can't just be some, right, ideological structure. It has to actually be an active dynamical system in you. And so what you're going to do, and again, I'll come back to this in more detail, you're going to try and cultivate a counteractive dynamical system, because that is how you will be able to respond to the dynamical systems of parasitic processing. And then I'm going to propose to you that a prototypical, by no means exclusive, so that's how I'm using it, but a prototypical example of this is the cultivation of the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, which is very, very perspicaciously represented by an eight-spoked wheel. The integration, it revolves, it evolves, etc. So what we're looking for here is a counteractive dynamical system. Okay, modal confusion. We've already talked about this, and this is sati, practices that are designed to invoke a deep remembrance of the being mode. Okay, the reflectiveness gap. You need the combination, the integration, the dynamic integration, not just a settled median point. You need the dynamic integration of immersion and creative flexibility. We know a state that does that. We're going to come back to this, but that's the flow state. You need to be cultivating the flow state in important ways. Okay, the clash of perspectives. This is going to take, again, so this, what I put on the board right now initially, is going to seem like what? So again, give me some time. I'm just going to put it on here. This is what Spinoza in the West called scientia intuitiva, or what in Buddhism in the East refers to as prajna. This is a state, right, in which you get the deep interpenetration of the perspectives, right? So I'm just going to put up here, and you're like, wow, what does that mean? How do you do that? Scientia intuitiva, prajna. But if you remember, just to foreshadow it, right, we talked about I can scale down, I can scale up, and then I can get this state of non-duality that is simultaneously scaling up and scaling down, and that actually alleviates the clash of perspectives. So we'll come back to this. Okay, so anxiety. This is inner dialogue. So this is to pick up, right, the idea of internalizing the sage, right? As the child is to the adult is to the sage. I want to, like, the way, so an exemplary example of this is, the Christians, it's not I who live, but Christ who lives in me, or the Buddhists, you have to realize your Buddha nature, or the Stoics, I have to internalize Socrates. And again, if you turn these into ideas to be believed rather than, practices that have actually been internalized and are integrated into your the development of your identity, then you're not hearing what I'm saying. Okay, so alienation. I haven't talked as much about this, but I'm going to come back to this more. This is to cultivate what Turner and other people call communitas. This is the sense of connectedness to other. And part of that is to try and recover what we had in Platonic dialogue. And what's happening right now is a whole movement called authentic discourse. I'm going to talk a lot more about that. The authentic discourse movement, right? Authentic discourse movement. But we just need authentic discourse here. Something like what we had in Platonic dialogue, something like therapy, sort of both beyond. I'll come back to that because this is a primary way of doing this. I gave you an extended argument for how you respond to existential entrapment. And of course, this is gnosis. And that this gnosis is going to have a connection to higher states of consciousness. Okay. There's something that's missing, right? And what's missing is we need, of course, an overall framing of these things, that the way we're pursuing all of these and the way we're trying to integrate them together, right? I'll put it here because I ran out of board on that side. All of this has to be within a wisdom framing. We're going to talk more explicitly. We're going to devote quite a bit of time to try and get at what can we now think about wisdom, given all the current work within psychology and cognitive science and even neuroscience on wisdom, right? Because throughout all of this, we have to have a cognitive style in which the amelioration of self-deception and the affordance of self-optimization are paramount. Okay? So I want to go through each one of these in more detail. This is the overarching structure, and then trying to bring it together. What is it I'm proposing to you? And see, and here's where my concern about hubris is here, although I think there's a legitimate point I'm making. I'm trying to argue for a way in which we can reverse engineer enlightenment. Instead of keeping enlightenment as an obscure state surrounded by mystique and nostalgia, we need an account that recognizes what that mystique pointed to but exaggerates, which is the difficulty of enlightenment. Right? But ultimately, if we have a kind of being, a ecology of psychotechnology that reliably and systematically, individually and collectively, allows us to address the perennial problems, I'm going to propose to you that that's what we should call enlightenment. If enlightenment is something above and beyond that, then I don't know what its value is. And if enlightenment is not directed towards this, I would say it is not something of value. So I'm going to propose to you that insofar as we can give, using the theoretical tools we've cultivated together, relevance realization, etc., insofar as we can, the work we've done on mindfulness, the work we've done on flow, right, all of it, insofar as we can give an account of this in terms that are ultimately naturalistic, that can be subject to scientific investigation, we will have, and this is this the final sort of challenge to the division given to us in the Enlightenment? We will have a scientific theory of enlightenment and what it can mean for us. All right. So let's talk about some of these. I'll talk about it more at length because they're more novel. Others I'll talk about more briefly because there's an extended discussion of them. So again, let's start with this notion of dealing with parasitic processing, which is an overarching thing. And the idea here is, as I said, to cultivate a set of practices, and that's what you have with something like the Eightfold Path, where you're trying to remember all of these, right aspiration, right mindfulness, right concentration, etc. Remember that the right is not moral righteousness. The right is right-handedness, it's dexterity. And now to use language that we've developed, it's right-fittedness, it's optimal fittedness, it's enhanced relevance realization within each one of these. And what you have, right, is a set of practices that are interdependent with each other, mutually supporting, and self-rolling, becoming a self-rolling wheel. And if I have a set of practices that can take on a life of its own, right? You have the metaphors, right, in Buddhism of you, like where you enter the stream, it takes on a life of its own. And initially, what I'm doing, right, is I'm cultivating this practice and this practice and this practice, and I've got sort of, but then they start to, right, implicitly interact, reinforce, develop, and it starts to become a counteractive dynamical system in me. The Buddha told a famous parable about how to understand this. He talks about the goldsmith. And the gold is something inherently valuable, and you should think of your mind as something inherently valuable, right? And he says, okay, so take a look at the goldsmith. The goldsmith just looks at the gold, no change is wrought. So if you're just sort of doing meditation and reflecting, nothing happens, right? The goldsmith has to heat up the gold, right? There has to be this right effort, the energy put in, maybe something like flow, right? But if the goldsmith just heats up the gold just melts and goes away, right? And then also there has to be the shaping, right? There has to be the reconfiguration, there has to be the cultivation of new skills, new abilities, new virtues. If you just hammer the gold, you'll smash it and wreck it. If you just heat it, it will melt. If you just look at it, you won't notice its imperfections. You will do nothing but notice its imperfections, but nothing will change. So I need to look in order to notice, but I need to balance that, integrate that dynamically with heating and with hammering. And notice what I'm doing. I'm creating this higher order skill of being a smith by getting a set of practices that have a complementary relationship to them. Each one has strengths and weaknesses, and the strengths and weaknesses are fitted together, so you get something overall that can produce something that the individual skills can't do. So by getting this fluid ecology of looking, of heating, and of shaping, then the gold becomes well-shaped, and it becomes, as he says, wieldy. You can wield it very well. It fits your hand and extends your capacity so well. So what you're getting there, right, is the strong recommendation for looking at this as, cultivating an ecology of practices, getting sets of practices, sets of psychotechnologies that have complementary relationships to each other, organizing them together, right? And we do this all the time. We create constellations of lower order skills and techniques to build higher order skills and techniques, but we build it as a dynamical system, a counteractive dynamical system that can operate in many ways on many levels of our cognition and our consciousness and our being. So the way to deal with parasitic processing is to cultivate a counteractive dynamical system. And this is why this is an overarching thing. So modal confusion, we've already talked about this. We've already talked about the way in which mindfulness practices and other practices, like that can be drawn from Stoicism, like the view from above, or objective seeing, can help us to remember sati, the being mode. Again, not as an idea, not as a belief, but as an existential mode that we can reliably reactivate and re-enter into in a viable and enriching manner. Okay, the reflectiveness gap and flow. Okay. So if I were to just speak this lecture impulsively, wantonly, just it'll become chaotic, right? It'll tend to, right, probably fall into self-contradiction. It will be confused and therefore confusing. But if I'm constantly stepping back and reflecting on what I'm saying and engaging in self-criticism and then thinking, I'll choke, right? So what do I do? Well, I try to get into the flow state. Because the flow state is a state in which I am both, and Vellman, by the way, argues for something very similar. He proposes Taoism, and Taoism as a solution to the reflectiveness gap. And of course, as I've argued, Taoism is basically the religion of flow in many ways. The yin and yang, the out and the in, right? The making frame and breaking frame, etc. So what you're trying to do is set up the practices that will afford flow, set up the conditions that will afford flow. And remember, we talked about the right kinds of conditions. And also, and this is where we're going to have to come back to wisdom, wisely cultivate your flow. Where and when and in what domains are you learning to flow? So I'm trying to get into the flow state here that will keep me sort of immersed and engaged with the material, but also make me hopefully very sort of flexible and capable when needed. I don't mean to be self-congratulatory, but where it's needed, hopefully insightful, that this is not just mechanical, that there's an element of sort of, a flow to it, almost like jazz with concepts and jazz with argumentation. Okay, so let's come back to absurdity and come back to prajna. I'm going to talk about this again. We did talk about this before, but I want to remind you of it, and that you are very capable of this, because your cognition is capable, because of the way attention works. Because attention, I've put it up multiple times, right? The cat and other things. Your attention is simultaneously bottom up from the features and top down from the gestalt, right? And your attention, right, the way you are related to the world is one in which the world and you can be co-creating. This is actually something that Spinoza talks quite a bit about in the Ethics, how your experience is co-created by the body and by the world. So, if you remember, Spinoza talks about this idea, right? When you're reading an argument, and his whole book, The Ethics, is an attempt to bring back blessedness and a sense of, I would argue, sacredness within a Cartesian scientific worldview. That's what's called the ethics. It means ethics in the older sense of becoming the best person leading the best kind of life, not just doing the morally correct thing. But Spinoza talks about this kind of knowing. And what I realized when I was reading the ethics, studying the ethics, you have to almost do lectio divina with the ethics. You have to read it. You have to really let it soak into you. You have to try and get that worldview attuned. You have to, what's it like to see the world as Spinoza did? So you have to sort of study and practice the ethics. So it's an extended period. And then he talks about this, and then I realized that the ethics was actually designed to do this. You have this tremendously tight logical structure, but the logical structure is trying to afford what he called scientia intuitiva, this sort of deeply intuitive knowing. And what he means by that is that you've got this tremendous argument that reaches up to the sort of the largest scale of reality, right? But there's individual premises along the way. And the idea here is, here's the analogy. So the premise is like the letter, the premises are like the letters, right? And the argument of arguments, all the arguments constellated together. So I'm going to call this the meta-argument, the arguments of argument, right? So these go up into arguments, right? And then the arguments, right, go up into the meta-argument. And this, of course, is like, through words into sentences kind of thing. And remember, we talked about how your attention is multiply layered in this way. And what can happen is, if you practice the ethics, you get to a place where you see the whole of the argument in each, the meta-argument in each premise, and you see how each premise and each argument fit into and contribute to the whole. Just like you're seeing the words in terms of the sentence and the letters in terms of the words, right? And it's simultaneously bottom up and top down in a completely interpenetrating fashion. And what you get is you get a cosmic perspective that is, right, interpenetrating with the perspective of your individual moment of thought. That's scientia intuitiva. There's a, right? There is a complete interleaving of the perspectival knowing. The Buddhists talk about something similar to this, prajna, a kind of self-liberating state of wisdom. And it's a state in which, you know, as D.T. Suzuki says, you're sort of simultaneously looking as deeply in as you can and simultaneously looking out as deeply as you can. And he quotes Eckhart, a Christian Neoplatonist, as a way of explaining this. You know, the eye by which I see God is the same eye by which God sees me. So the perspective that reaches out and upwards to what's ultimate is the same as the perspective that is coming deeply into me. And what you get, right, is you practice sort of scaling down as deeply as you possibly can towards something like the pure consciousness event, and scaling down. And you practice scaling up to this sense of sort of profound, resonant at-one-ment with everything. And then what happens is you get, I mean, when in practice you are alternating between them. But then, as I mentioned, what eventually happens is you get non-duality. You're simultaneously as deeply in and as deeply down, sorry for these metaphors, as you can be, but as I said, they're often indispensable. You're simultaneously as deeply down and as deeply in and as simultaneously as out and as up as you can be. You're sort of at maximal breaking frame, maximal breaking frame and maximal making frame, and they are optimally dynamically integrated, like they are in right, sort of the most optimal, profound insight you can have. So that state is a place that addresses absurdity. And you say, but it doesn't answer any of the arguments for absurdity. But that's the point. There is no argumentative response to absurdity because the arguments that are supposed to be generating absurdity don't generate absurdity. They're after the fact expressions of absurdity. What drives absurdity is perspectival clash. And if you can reliably realize a state in which you overcome the perspectival clash. And remember, you can overcome lower order perspectival clash in humor. And humor has at the core of it a kind of insight and a kind of joy in that insight. You can have something like that. There's a continuum. You can have the overcoming of the perspectival clash with this prajnic state of non-duality that carries with it a kind of joy, a kind of insight, a kind of scientia intuitiva, a deep intuitive knowing. And so that is very doable for us. So, anxiety. So what anxiety is about, right, is there's a nebulous sense that, right, something is wrong, and it's connected to inner conflict. You know, we see both. We see this in Christianity, the inner conflict. Paul. We see it in Plato, in the inner conflict. There's different centers working according to different goals, and they're at war with each other, and we suffer. And it's a dramatic sense of threat, but it has no specific target, of course, as fear does, because Of course, anxiety, the threat is endemic to you. So no matter where you go, you're sensing the threat, but there's nothing that the threat can particularly attach to, because the threat has to do with your inner, the state of being at war within yourself. So we see across the traditions the idea of internalizing the sage to create an inner dialogue that helps to coordinate the various centers, gets them to talk to each other. And I think this is something where cognitive science can actually give us tremendous help. We've had a lot of increase in our knowledge of the various different areas of cognition, even different kinds of centers processing in the brain, and how they work and how they're operating. And what we need is, right, an internalized representation, a model, a role model, and a role is a way of taking on a new identity, right? We need a role model for how we can engage in dialogue. And the proposal here, which is of course the Platonic proposal we already saw, that if I can internalize my capacity and developed by the Stoics, my capacity to interact with the sage, eventually I get that ability that I have only with the sage. I can have it with myself, within myself. And it means, therefore, that it becomes part of my metacognitive machinery, the way I dialogue with myself and get the various aspects of myself, the various centers to dialogue with each other. And you can see various versions of this. You can see Jung's use of active imagination as a way of trying to create an inner dialogue between different centers of the psyche, right? You can see practices like Lectio Divina, where I am reading the text and I am trying to get the text to speak to me, is also allowing aspects of the different aspects of the psyche to talk to each other through the text. So there is a lot we can do. So as I mentioned to you, the process of identification, where you're identifying with something like the sage, right? Obviously, it makes use of our capacity for internalizing the perspective of others, but it also requires what Polanyi called the capacity for indwelling, right? So remember, indwelling is when I'm perceiving through the pen. I'm indwelling it. So you not only have to internalize the sage, but you have to indwell the sage. You have to practice, right? And that fits in with other things. To practice trying to, what does it look like, right? What is it like to see things the way the sage does? You have to seriously play at being the sage without pretense or arrogance or inflation. That's why wisdom is going to matter to all of this, right? So I practice indwelling the sage, right? And and people think, what would Socrates do? What would Aristotle do? What would Jesus do, right? And you have to regularly practice. So you practice indwelling, and then you practice internalizing. And you practice indwelling, and then you practice internalizing, right? And that is how you basically start to afford the internalization of the sage and the creation of your ability, as Antisthenes said, what he learned from Socrates so long ago, to converse with yourself, to enter into something like Platonic dialogue with yourself. All right. What about alienation? So alienation takes us towards something talked about by Emile Durkheim and Victor Turner and others, communitas. Communitas is what you feel when you're watching with other people, what's happened recently, the Raptors, and everybody was gathered together, and we have shared attention, and we are getting in sync together, and we have that sense of communing and communicating with each other, and there is a shared spirit amongst us all. That's communitas. That's communitas. Communitas, right, is basically a way of getting collective flow going. But it's also something else. It's a collective flow in which we feel like there is real communication between people and something deeper. There's real communion. There's a sense of participating in a shared identity of some kind. So this has to be with, this has to do with sort of taking a careful look at careful look at the way in which our practices of communication and communing have been so undermined by bullshitting and modal confusion and an adversarial political culture, etc. And so what's been happening, and as I said, part of the gift of the video series is I've gotten to meet more and more people who are trying to do this. They're putting real time and talent into cultivating individual and communal responses to the meaning crisis. So I've got to interact with, for example, Peter Limberg, who's been introducing me to authentic discourse, authentic relating practices. I will talk a little bit about this in a minute. And then, for example, I've got to meet and have some interesting dialogue. One interview, not one interview, sort of one dialogue with him is out, and there's another one coming. Because what Jordan Hall is trying to do is he's trying to do two things in an integrated fashion. I see him trying to do. He's trying to free communication from the cultural grammar that has got us where we are. In that sense, he's trying to respond deeply to the history, not in theory, but in the actual practice. And that is bound up with, as my argument has tried to show, that is bound up with the project of trying to re-access in a powerful and perspicacious manner these other kinds of knowing, and that making our communication and our communing not just a matter of propositional exchange or conflict, but trying to tap into, right, the underlying procedural knowing, and how that procedural knowing is dependent on the underlying perspectival situational awareness, the perspectival knowing, and how that is ultimately dependent on the participatory process of our ongoing evolving attunement from which the agent and the arena co-emerge. And so I see him trying to do that. I see him trying to create a way in which we can get what he calls coherence, a kind of communitas, I would say, that is directed towards engaging the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. And remember that most of our real world problem solving, contrary to the bullshit we tell ourselves about how we're self-made individuals, most of our problem solving is done in concert. Serious play, concert music, is done in concert with other people. And so what he is trying to do is create, he extends towards, right, a state called coherence, in which we are creating a kind of communicas that is marshalling distributed cognition and its collective intelligence for simultaneously freeing us from the ways in which we are boxed in, like the 9-dog problem, by our historical cultural cognitive grammar, access the other kinds of knowing, and bring that to bear on the problems that we are facing. So I want to talk a little bit, I'll just introduce the idea. There's a book, I'm Cohering the Integral We Space, Enabling Collective Emergence, Wisdom, and Healing in Groups. I've gone to a circling practice already. I'm not an expert in it. I want to become one. I want to take it seriously. So I'm only gesturing towards it. But it is a communal practice in which this is my best way of trying to explain it to you. You're engaging in something like you're engaging in a mindfulness practice, something like Platonic dialogue, and you're creating something like a collective flow state, so that what emerges, right, is a dynamical system. And as I basically have been proposing throughout the last few lectures, that the word spirit is basically pointing towards dynamical systems that, right, are evolving. We create a dynamical system that gives people the resources to address their capacity for being in touch with themselves and each other. It's not therapy, although it overlaps with some of the gnosis in therapy as well. You know this. You know that when things are right and you get in sync with another person or another group of people, and we talked about this with Platonic dialogue, something emerges. There's a collective, right, that emerges there that takes your cognition and everybody else's in places that you can't go individually. You participate in that, but you don't make it. You're not just a passive recipient of it. You're not just a patient of it, right? You're participating in it. And so I want to learn more about this, but there is a growing, and the circling practice overlaps with other practices that Peter and I are learning about, where Peter talks about, a process he calls the anti-debate, where we turn adversarial debating. We have techniques for turning it into authentic relating, where we're trying to get insight rather than victory in our debating processes. There's lots of books coming out on this, like Verbal Aikido and Verbal Judo. So there is the beginning of a whole set of practices for bringing about authentic discourse that can really address the issues of alienation. Okay. Now, of course, as I said, the response to existential entrapment is gnosis, and we had extended discussion about that and its interconnection with higher states of consciousness. So I'm not going to talk about that at great length. Please go back and look at that gnosis. But what I would say is that gnosis seems to need, and you see this with Jeep form, and you see this in therapy, it needs that open-ended mythos that the Gnostics talked about. I'm not advocating their particular mythos. I'm not saying their metaphysics is correct, but that transgressive, the open-ended, ongoing, right, symbol, the ongoing mythos. These seem to be needed for the cultivation of gnosis, and so I would recommend that to you. So what I want to do next time is come back and put this all together, what it looks like, and then start talking about the overall framing of this, the way we frame, how we cultivate the individual psychotechnologies, the individual practices, and how we also constellate the ecology of those in a state of enlightenment within a wisdom framing. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, well, meant to come back to that earlier, but it was all just kind of...
Meow, 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 meow. Yeah, there's so much there. Rough, rough. Rough, rough, rough. Rough, 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 rough. Yeah.
All right, so the whole what to do about all this, we talked about, briefly in this, and then in more depth in the last episode, we talked about the problems. So now what to do?
We're trying to respect where we really are, what the situation really is, and what we have access to throughout our human history that we can pull back up to the present and get into communication with one another and start to incorporate these various practices together. So he started showing us now what are the actionable solutions to the downsides of our relevance realization that has gotten us into this meaning crisis.
So, yeah.
Man. This is so cool the way he's broken. Now we're finally at the actionable solution point, but he had to explicate the problem in great detail and the various capacities humans have and prove them scientifically before getting us to this point to where this was a theory that he could reasonably propose.
So we got
here we
into
are.
the functional end. So the
Yep.
first of the function is the self-organizing aspect. So the downside is parasitic processing.
Yep.
His solution for this is cultivating counteractive dynamical systems that you internalize. And his example was the cultivation of the Eightfold Path
Yes.
for that.
Yes. An ecology of practices to cultivate a counteractive dynamical system that helps to counteract the parasitic dynamical systems that we have going on.
And
So,
yeah, like, literally counteract them. So they're going one way, you're throwing a force in the other direction to at least pause it for a moment.
slow it down,
Yeah.
pause it, maybe start to turn it and wind it in the opposite direction. That's the hope here. That's right. We're trying to reverse a tornado, basically. And he makes a point also. He brings up the Eightfold Path, but that's just a prototypical, not exclusive example. There's
Yeah,
many,
yeah.
Stoicism, Christianity, there's many other wisdom traditions that offer great, helpful solutions that we can fold into one another and start to come up with an even stronger solution here.
So there's the self ID, which is modal confusion.
Yep, we can have modal confusion. We get confused and we get stuck in this having mode orientation. When we don't need to be in a having mode orientation, we can be back in our being mode. You need having mode to be able to obtain things like food and water and shelter and things like that. But if we can even do that from our being mode, so that we can be consciously aware of how we're acting in response to the world and one another, others we interact with.
And so the prescription for that is sati, and we talked
Sati,
about that
remembering
in
the
the previous
being
episodes. Yes,
Yes.
just looking back, and then the problems with reflection and the reflectiveness gap issue is the flow state.
Yes, the flow state is the solution, and to our modal confusion. So we have anxiety as well, and under self-identification problems. We need something that gives us deep interpenetration, that the capacity. So we have these states of self-transcendence we can experience. You have the state of all-knowing and the states of oneness. And so the scaling up and scaling down, we want to be happening at once. This is the middle way that the Buddha tried to describe to the world.
Yeah.
Allow these different modes to be in inner dialogue. And to solve this, we can internalize the sage.
Yeah.
And then we get to alienation. The sense of connectedness to the other can help heal this. Authentic discourse.
Yeah, and
can
the word
help
he
this.
used for that was communitas,
Communitas.
which will come up more. And then we
Yes.
have existential entrapment, gnosis and higher states of consciousness. And all these things, we must have them wrapped within a wisdom framing to avoid the self-deception and bullshit,
Yes.
while improving ourselves, and that's the purpose of the wisdom, right? Is to know what's appropriate, when, where, and why. Well, maybe not necessarily exactly why, but you can intuit that too.
So I just realized I was going off of my previous notes from earlier in the episode. Yeah, so parasitic processing, again, we're looking to cultivate this set of practices where fittedness is maximized. I'm just catching up in my notes here with you, and I just want to add a couple more notes here. We needed to be able to get this fittedness maximized in a way that takes on a life of its own. That's in which these various practices are reinforcing one another, so that we can really charge up this counteractive dynamical system to balance our capacities, to get higher order overall abilities. Out of the previous abilities, we bring them together, a new skill set emerges. Complementary relations are organized together in a counteractive dynamical system that can operate in ways beneficial to the individual human and society as a whole. So then we went modal confusion again, guys.
Well,
we're talking about mindfulness practices, stoicism that can help us remember sati, re-inhabit the being mode, and how flow state is a solution here. Triggers flow and optimizes. This is Taoism is like the religion of the flow state Vervaeke was describing. So to be able to be flexible, so we need movement practices. And then, of course, the solution to absurdity is prajna, attention. is being both bottom up and from the top down at once. We have this capacity. Our relation to be with the world, in relation with the world, is co-creative. And we talked on Spinoza here.
Yeah.
Do you remember this one? The ethics.
A lot of this is covered on the individual ones, because he just listed them out, and then we're going deeper into there. So
he gave us so much insight in this episode, though. He was really going fast.
So on the more in-depth one, we should probably just start at cultivation and work our way through, because there is so much instead of going over it. All
Yeah,
of them
I'm
again.
moving pretty fast at this point. We're on to.
So let's just call it. We're at parasitic
Cultivation,
processing. We're at parasitic processing at the top of the board for the very first one. He went further into it, and his prescription is, cultivating a set of practices that are independent, interdependent, and self-rolling.
That's it.
And that's the counter-dynamic system. And he gave a story example of this, of the goldsmith. You look at the gold, nothing happens. You melt it, well, you just get melted stuff. But once you craft it, so you put some intention into it and technique into it and practice into it, then you get art. And all three of these give the value of it. So they're in a complementary relationship. So to expand that, you take different sets of psychotechnologies, develop and cultivate them, then bring them all together and then apply them.
Yes.
And that's, how we get out of the parasitic processing.
Yes, because we're becoming more fitted to the world. Fittedness is being maximized. And then the modal confusion, of course, ways that trigger flow to optimize the conditions in which we can be increasingly flexible and have access to what's needed in a fluid, easy way. Like we're just interacting with life fluidly with the least amount of stress and resistance.
Yep.
And then absurdity is solved by
Well,
ethics.
before the absurdity is the reflectiveness gap and flow state.
Yes, yeah.
But both scaling up and down at the same time. So set up practices and conditions that enhance the flow state.
Yes.
And to a certain extent also must be responsible and get grounded in wisdom again, particularly with dealing with the flow state.
And prajna is a self-liberating state of wisdom. You're looking as far in and as far out as you can at once.
So to deal with absurdity is prajna.
It's prajna, yes.
Yes. Which...
sorry, you were still on modal confusion there.
No, I was still on reflectiveness gap.
Well,
which actually leads into dealing with absurdity, because absurdity,
right, yes.
We're now in the realm of getting into the non-dual state. And, you can say, like, practice the epics, which are a system of intuitive knowing. So there's argument in one direction and argument in the other direction, and seeing both of them.
Yes.
And seeing the fittedness of both of them to the whole, and then, which allows you to see the one argument. And I'm only using the word argument because it's not it's a good example, but it's not necessarily
It's the
like, it doesn't have to
propositional
be.
state of knowing. You're seeing all the different propositional states at once.
Yeah.
So you're seeing the actual problem space more clearly when you understand the various arguments from the various perspectives.
So there is no argument against absurdity because it's after the fact. So it's a perspectival clash. So using this prajna.
That's right.
Technique.
So you need something different. You can't just have an argument or a proposition to solve absurdity. You need something else. So what prajna gives us is worldview attunement through the practice of ethics. The logical structure of ethics helps us to develop intuitive knowing, as DJ was saying. So Spinoza talks about the ethics of blessedness and sacredness, and that's an aspect of ethics that we've lost. So we're bringing to life that realization, that remembrance, that sati again in this case. And he speaks on the difference. If you practice ethics, you can see the whole argument holistically. You gain the cosmic perspective that interpenetrates with individual level of thoughts as well. So and he brings up the quote, "The eye by which I see God is the eye by which God sees me." That's the prajna state.
Yeah.
It's a meta argument. It's going from the premises, like the ethics, which are like the little letters, to the meta state of wisdom, where you are looking as far in and as far out as once, and you are able to be simultaneously in those states. Now the scaling down to pure consciousness and up to
The
the
Gestalt.
sense of oneness, the gestalt and oneness with everything. To be able to do this as much as possible allows us maximum frame breaking potential and frame making potential at once. So this is the optimizing of that frame breaking and making capacity that we have. This addresses the absurdity. Because there's, like we were saying, no propositional or argumentative way to study or approach it.
Yeah, and flow state practices can help with this as well, because when you're in a flow state, say like musically speaking, you are solving many problems at once. You have many different propositions coming at you, particularly when you're playing with other people.
And everything's deeply meaningful.
Yeah, and
so it's helping. I can see how it would
you're
help
seeing
ameliorate that
you're
sense
seeing
of
the part,
absurdity.
the individual part and the whole thing at the same time as well.
Practicing solving things is what
Yeah.
music is. It's like mathematical problems and solutions that we hear.
And sometimes you can be humorously absurd with it as well, by breaking it, and then.
Well, by celebrating the absurdity, you're learning how to write it joyfully.
And I would actually probably argue that humor, the reason why it works so well for absurdity is because it is very much doing this. It's scaling up and scaling down.
Yep.
It's making proposition up, proposition down at the same time. Then with a nice little punchline, aha, at the end that gets you to
It
laugh,
switches your perspective, and then it puts you into sati mode, and you're back into like the moment and being. You're laughing with surprise. It has a joyful insight to it. He said, "I like that."
Yeah. So now we have anxiety,
Yes.
which is the inner conflict with no specific target. So it's not like fear.
Yeah.
It, as in, like, I fear the dog biting me. It's just anxiety.
It's a non-specific sense of threat
Yeah.
in the world. The sense of something wrong that has to do with inner conflict, but there's nothing that you can target that seems to be the source of it. It's just like a non-specific sense of threat. So it's a state of being at war within oneself. Yeah. So how do we help solve this? We can internalize the sage to incorporate the various centers of our psyche. And so not only do we need to internalize this through or we can internalize, let's say this, through a model, a representation, a role model, a model for how we can orient ourselves.
Yeah,
how
not
to
necessarily
exchange in dialogue.
and not necessarily like a role model, like like Captain America is my role model. Well, in a sense, I guess you could see that, but like more like when he was talking about like internalizing Plato, the Platonic mode. You get these two different, or you get these multiple little conflicting parts in your head to all start talking with each
together,
other inside.
Yeah. So our capacity to interact with the sage, we can actually turn this within, and we can have within that interaction such that it becomes a part of our own metacognitive capacity. So it becomes a holistic capacity for ourselves to think through, to be through. So this process of identification.
Yeah. So it's internalizing the sage and identification, because internalizing the sage, it's like the other person's perspective or the other side of the argument, but then indwelling, seeing through that argument,
Practicing what it's like to see as the sage does. Like, what would Jesus do? What would Socrates do? What would Buddha do?
Yeah, like
to indwell from his perspective and see it from the sage's perspective, to practice at it, just like we do when we're kids. We role play.
Yeah.
Different parental roles or different professional roles and things through the partaking in co-creative story to begin to get a grasp on this idea that's so complex to us at first. So it helps us get a handle.
Sure. You can play at something without completely understanding it. Like, the children don't understand the whole like, oh, welcome home, honey, from work. They don't know what work is. You just leave.
They have a very low resolution,
but it's still
idea in their minds of it. But it's enough to get a handle on it.
Well, because
to begin to get to know it. It's just like you got to learn to start riding a bike somewhere, and at first your sense of balance and how the thing feels and how it reacts to you is really not well informed at all. It goes from zero to increase in potential on into forever.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, so there's a really good example of indwelling, and to a certain extent self internalizing the sage. There's this group. There's
Socratic dialogue.
Yeah, there's this group of guys and gals, and maybe a they. Don't mean to offend anybody. Love those guys, but critical role, and basically their voice. And some of you probably know who they are, but basically they're voice actors playing Dungeons and Dragons. And there's a technique in acting that is very much off the cuff improv role play. So you're given like base parameters. You're in this place. This thing is happening, and each one of them has, you know, a character that they're developing and has to respond as that character. So indwell that character, and you can see when they break. And it's a story; it's just their character, but they're, you know, really getting into it, and not just to create a good storyline, but you have to like, what would your character do under a certain circumstance when the dragon's coming? But like,
That's the best
your
way to
friend
do
over
it.
there that you really, really love is about to die. Like, are you going to go? And like, you can see the decisions made. And like, when you get into that, and you know, since they are voice actors, they're very practiced at doing that. You can see their emotions and they break down. Like,
sounds fun.
And you get, yeah, dude, it's really interesting. And even if you don't like Dungeons
What's that called?
Critical Role.
Critical
They're
Role.
on their third campaign, Hell's Bells.
All right, on. Check out
that.
Critical Role, guys.
If you're interested in watching people really do that and do it very well and be entertained at the same time. It gets a little confusing though, because you know they'll be like in character and at the moment be like, "Hey DM, better da 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 da," and you're like, "Damn, broke me out of it." And then they're back, and you're like, "Oh wow." So yeah, and well, there are a bunch of nerds that I'm sure grew up with a bunch of anxiety. So these practices seem to actually work. You
Get
know,
out your box, kids.
theater kids actually, like, this is one way they deal with anxiety is they get a group, and you see a lot of they get in the group and
A
they
shy person can often be a great actor because putting on a mask allows you to act through another in a different role that is separated from your own.
yeah.
You know, so it's a whole different ball game now, consciously. So now we move on to
Alienation.
alienation. The solution for this is communitas.
Yeah, so flowing communion.
Collective flow or communal flow. That sense of when you feel in sync in a deep conversation where you're kind of figuring things out together.
And it's real communication.
It's real
Like you're
communication.
both getting it.
Yes, and it's become so deep that a sense of the logos can emerge, and they call this dialogos, or Vervaeke has termed this dialogos. It's communion as in a shared identity that is the culmination, the incorporation of all the identities in the circle,
Sure.
sharing this conversation. But it's something new
But
as well that is above and beyond everybody together,
And they're all there
and you can sense it.
for a specific purpose, even though the identities of like,
You'll sense it when it takes hold, because it's like your brains come into sync. And I don't know if they've done studies of people's neural activity under these states yet, but
send them an email. Like, I'm sure
Maybe they
those,
have.
Those may be the guys to
feel like
know
maybe they
or
have, but-
can.
well, it does. They have done this with people in sports, and they do get into a sympathetic state of resonance as far as the activity of their brain waves is concerned. They get into a certain state that they're all unified in. This is really cool stuff. So this is a capacity we have for problem solving. This is true problem solving. It's the highest level of problem solving.
And so we're going to have to also look into how our practices of communication are being undermined by the bullshit.
Yes, they have been severely corrupted by our failing political and social systems.
Yeah.
So authentic discourse, authentic relating is the solution here. And then he gets into Jordan Hall.
Yeah.
Something you want to say before that?
No, I just got to figure out what this freaking word is. Reaccesses. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this authentic discourse or relating reaccesses are other kinds of knowing, and how they are also interdependent.
Yes.
In the process of attunement. So like much like the string, you're attuning yourself to the world. You're tuning yourself to the chord.
Yes, that's right. So you can play a chord, and you're tuning the individual strings to get that proper chord effect.
So using the perspectival, the participatory, the having trouble naming off.
Yeah, so the procedural knowing depends on our perspectival knowing, which depends upon our participatory process, attunement in the agent arena relationship. So he speaks on Jordan Hall here because he's trying to bring all of this together at once, and as a way to get what he terms coherence. And look at Jordan Hall's work; it is stellar. He's on YouTube, he's on Substack as well as that, or is it Medium? He has a Medium page, I remember, where he talks about the red church and the blue church. His terminology is really, really intriguing. He's an incredible person to listen to, engaged in dialogue as well. And he has several conversations that he's taken part in with Vervaeke, including not just one-on-ones, but dialogos or circling sessions between him and several other people that are kind of in their grouping that are all working together on the meaning crisis. Jordan Hall is the guy that actually invented the Divic codec, which helped us get video on the internet in the first place. And after achieving great success professionally, he then turned his literally genius level brain onto these same problems that Vervaeke has been looking at. So to see these two guys come into conversation together is so cool. It feels like we're seeing new Socratic style minds come into a Socratic dialogue together in our midst, and they're putting it out on the internet for us all to be able to engage with. This is the first time we've been able to perhaps have the opportunity to do this globally. So Jordan Hall, he wants to get coherence. He wants to help us develop communitas to engage our collective intelligence capacities, the most powerful problem-solving potential that we have, in concert, to marshal our distributive cognition and its collective intelligence to free us of the problems, to bring to bear on the problems
the
we're facing.
historical grammar that we've used as well.
Yes, to free us from the historical grammar that we're caught up in.
To access our abilities and to apply them as well.
Different types of knowing, the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory states of knowing, because you don't just know what something is, you know how it feels to interact with it, and from your own perspective, and what it feels to be in participation with somebody, such as in a husband-wife or student-teacher kinds of relationships. And so this is deeper other kinds of knowing that we have that are in our being mode that we can engage to face the meaning crisis. So we talked about circling, a mindfulness practice that is also engaged in Platonic dialogue at once to give people that dynamical systems and the resources for being in touch with each other.
Yeah, so the idea is to create an emergent dynamical system that gives people the resources to adapt one and all's fittedness. And that's this coherence.
That's what
schema,
helps bring about coherence. That's a good way of putting that. It's the coherence, part of the coherence schema that Jordan Hall is elucidating.
Yeah.
So the collective sense emerges so that we're not just going through this individually, or we're going through this communally. And developing these styles of discourse that can address alienation.
And there's things that must be practiced as well. So this is like, as we're creating these things, there must be practices that you do in order to embody the lessons from it and understanding it, and also
internalize them and embody them. Explicate them, share in them. So this is the entrapment solution now. He just goes over very briefly because there's a previous episode. I forget. It was the ones on
Gnosis and higher states of consciousness.
There it is.
I think is the one. But so basically, you want the Gnosis is an open-ended mythos that's ever evolving. So it's a symbol, a mythos symbol that's ever evolving, and so it's not just writing one thing down and that's it. Well, it keeps going. This whole the myths change, and they should change because our experiences, our perceptions of the world, how we engage with it, are always going to change.
Yes.
One way or another. Yes. It's always a change, and everything's evolving. It's not just one. Once you're fitted, you're not just fit there.
Right.
The world changes. You have to fit yourself again.
So the myths of our past were fit to the cultural frameworks of their times. And some aspects of those are going to be hard for us to comprehend and relate to. Some of them are going to seem like, abhorrent to us in some ways. Because that's how people had found a way to relate with the world at that point in time.
Or plain silly, like Zeus would come down to Earth as a goose and impregnate ladies. That seems pretty silly, but in that period of time, the goose symbolized something. Zeus had his own, what would you call it?
Fertility, maybe.
A portfolio of responsibilities, if you will, that he's responsible for. He's the head god. Then there's the fracturing, and the gods used to be perfect, but no, now they're not perfect. Or the gods used to be impartial and just, more like the Titans. They make the weather and all that stuff, but now they're more like people and they're imperfect. And it's like,
And they
well,
can give us also good moral examples, or show us what bad moral examples are.
but then the idea of God changes to, well, then, gods should be perfect, because then what's higher than
You want something
human level?
transjective, that's beyond the objective and the subjective that we can always continue to rise
So
to.
things change, and we're just talking about the nature of God there, but
But then we got stuck in a two worlds mythology where there's this perfect thing up in the sky, and then us down here just being judged mercilessly. And it's like, actually, that's where a lot of the New Testament work seemed to be saying, no, but God is actually infinitely merciful. You are infinitely loved and accepted just as you are.
in me,
He
and
still
in
wants
you.
you to grow in you.
You're not in this shoebox in
best.
God's closet. If
But
anything,
you're forgiven no matter what.
and also God is in this shoebox with us.
Yes.
Not just lording over.
Yes. God's love is perfected through us.
There is no shoebox.
So we've been trying to figure out how to solve the two worlds mythology for a while. Even in Christianity, this was already happening. And in Buddhism, this was happening. But we've lost touch with these wisdom traditions that helped us at least get some sort of a handle and a way to optimize our interaction with one another and with the world around us. And they weren't perfect, but we've been constantly calibrating. Sometimes we take 2 steps forward or 2 steps back before we take 1 step forward, it seems. But
the cha-cha, 1 step forward and 2 steps back.
There's going to be 3 steps forward again at some point, or 4 or 5 or 10. And
well, I guess at the end of it,
how do we help
if we do it
bring
right,
that about?
It'll be a forward relationship of 1 over time. So an average of 1 over. One step forward. You might take 10 steps back at one point in time, and then you're like, 20 steps forward, and then 9 steps back.
I think we are. It's just alarming when we take the steps back, because when you take 2 steps back from where you were, and it's only on a count of 4, it's pretty far. That's halfway. It could be quite an abrupt, excessive situation. So,
but that's all I got.
Ultimately, the entrapment solution is this positive sense of gnosis. That is an open-ended mythos that is transgressive, beyond subjective and objective, that is open-ended and ongoing, ever-growing, ever upgradable or updatable, you could say. And I like that. And that's I like what he's given us so far here. It's not separating us or condemning the wisdom traditions, so one can still be a Christian or a Buddhist or even an atheist and engage with what Vervaeke is offering us. We can all develop a sense of the sacred.
Well, and I think the problems that we're having come before the solutions like religion or other practices. So what we're experiencing, isn't something that's only within the religious end of things. It's actually something that religion was developed to be able to help deal with, which is ultimately, what are we doing here? What's going on? What are we? Is there something else? And if there is, what's my relationship with it? The standard life's questions. So it's suiting to be able to go to, for him to be trying to develop, this set of techniques, this
counteractive dynamical systems
to go directly to the core of it, while using all the awesome things like different religions and practices that have already been doing it to still get at the same core
help
problem.
Inform and incorporate with one another to help us solve the same problem they've all been trying to solve.
Because this is a problem beyond
separate
religion,
fashion.
beyond meditation, beyond anything. It's the core, and it's the furthest out of our human existence.
It's so deep in us. Our, like he says over and again for us, relevance realization, our capacity for becoming fitted to the world and more connected to the world is also, it's like a double-edged sword. It has these downsides that also lead to parasitic processing and so on. And they create these perennial problems. So being able to be more fitted in more relation and increasingly higher order is the solution to counteract. So developing dynamical systems, which will take an ecology of practices and conversation, so that we recognize we're in a constant calibration in relation.
And frankly, if he's wrong with all this,
of co-creation with the sacred.
If he's wrong with all this, and what he's trying to do is futile, the world is still a better place for him having done it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things in your life. It's like, well, you know, like that can lead you to self-failure. It's like, well, you know, what if I do all this stuff and it's wrong or, you know, stupid? Well, I'm sure you got something out of it and other people got something out of it. Nothing is completely, totally 100% wrong. Well, I won't say nothing, but probably the vast majority of things are at least have a nugget of something right in there, or at least the attempt.
Or at least the intentionality. can be
Unless
right,
you
know?
force, like, the only way I could see this kind of thing going wrong is if some crazy, manipulative, horrible people after Vervaeke and his contemporaries die get a hold of this and pervert it, just like a lot of other things have been done.
This would be hard to pervert because from the ground up, it's recognizing.
It's a living. It looks like it's going to be a living practice that
Yes,
people
it's
are doing.
important. He describes throughout the series that we're a species that can frame something and then breaks the frame, and it's ideal for us to be good at breaking frames. Now, you could argue against this and say, no, you should have a very sturdy, solid frame that never changes.
Or no frame at all.
Or no frame at
because
all.
Frames are
Which,
oppressive.
of course, that is itself a frame of
right,
thinking.
yeah.
That, of course,
The
is a
frame
view
that is no
you're seeing
frame.
through. Yeah, so you can't live in this world without having views on things. But how do we create a view that integrates with one another, that we're open to be advised by one another, and we're going to be in dialogue, learning together, even from different people with different points of view from our own. That's a whole nother orientation. It's the agape love orientation that we spoke of earlier, that Christ and Buddha represented for us. So that's it, guys. That's the name of the game. We are deep in it now. Episode 37 was awesome, guys. Give some likes and subscribes to Vervaeke for this work. He's on Spotify, he's on Apple, he's on YouTube, he's on Twitter now.
He
X.
seems to be everywhere at this point.
He's all
now.
over the place now. His team is doing good work. He's doing extraordinary work. And, of course, standing on the shoulders of giants, which he admits often. And at this episode, he had to address the hubris of trying to approach something like this. Yeah. But that's why he says this is an open-ended thing. This is just us beginning to try and figure out how to approach the meaning crisis. How can we solve it? And develop an actual actionable theoretical framework for doing so. And that's it, guys. It's been an awesome journey so far. We have not too many, like 12 episodes left now.
We'll be on 38 next week, so it's 12 episodes. Boy,
thank you for joining us, guys. And if you are in the DC, Baltimore area, check our band out. We got a couple shows coming up. August 26th is going to be at Bad Habits. It's a festival with several different bands.
Bad Habits,
and
Martinsburg,
playing
West
all
Virginia.
day and into the evening, and we're going to be playing at 2:45 there. So come on out, check it out. Or September 2nd, the following week, we're going to be playing at Blue Fox in Winchester, Virginia, with Novarium and Fairy's Death Waltz. We'd love to see you guys. Come on out if you're in the area. And once again, we love you. Thank you so much for being here. Help this show grow by sharing it with your friends and family. And smash that like and subscribe. We will see you next time.
Peace. Meow.